The sun had already set below the horizon, but neither it nor the light clouds that had been glowing in the sky just half an hour ago were visible. Now the sky had been replaced by a concrete monolithic ceiling, rising a dozen meters high. Ron tried shining his flashlight higher, but it seemed as if the darkness lurking in this place had gathered into a dense mass and refused to go far, wedging itself into the cracks in the concrete and clinging to the walls with its sharp tentacles like a giant octopus. That damn tunnel. Ron tried to gather his thoughts. Just a short while ago, he had been driving along a country road through the woods in northern Romania, where he had come on vacation with his sister from Scotland. His sister had stayed at the hotel to drink warm mulled wine and stroll through the town's autumnal, yet still warm, streets. He, on the other hand, had always been drawn to the unknown and the charm of the past. So when he learned from the locals that there was an abandoned village deep in the forest, he decided to rent an old car and drive there in a single evening. The road wasn't exactly straight. Sometimes it was paved, and other times, after a fork in the road, it sank into thick mud and sprawling juniper branches. A couple of times, the wheels clattered over some kind of brickwork, and Ron was sure he was already close to his destination. But his GPS had shut down halfway through this wilderness. The internet had cut out even earlier, and the signal was barely visible as a single bar on the display. But none of that mattered. Ron was used to the fact that both longed for and forgotten places lied far from civilization. Back home, he'd often visited abandoned castles and houses, once even a small forgotten port town. But there, on the islands, everything was closer and more compact. Here on the mainland, however, the roads were noticeably longer and unfamiliar to him. Ron may have been young, but he was clearly no fool. He set out before dawn, having thoughtfully warned his sister about a short personal trip. He took 2 flashlights with him, a small pocket one and a bright camping one, a bottle of water, a box of chocolate bars, and a signal pistol. The flare gun wasn't strictly necessary, but if he ran into a wild animal, it would certainly scare it off. He left a note in the hotel lobby with his coordinates, indicating where he was supposed to arrive. All in all, the guy was prepared for any unwanted incidents, not wanting to become the victim of a low-budget horror movie. Back in his hometown, Ron had had a couple of run-ins with aggressive vagrants, but here, in such a remote area, he didn't expect to encounter any homeless people. And it wasn't a natural phenomenon that stopped him, but something created by human hands. The road had just started to climb uphill and then dropped sharply. The young man didn't have time to react when the road suddenly began to slope downward. The climb ended in a fairly steep cliff. He slammed on the brakes, but the car skidded down the wet ground, and after bouncing a couple of times and hitting his head against the roof lining, Ron plummeted into the darkness, feeling the impact against the wall. The car had ended up in a tunnel, and as it skidded, it struck a curve and came to a halt. At first, darkness engulfed the entire world, and for a few seconds, Ron felt his cervical vertebrae go numb and his hands freeze, clenched tightly around the steering wheel. A blinding light pressing against his eyes radiated out in painful circles. But little by little, the numbness began to recede, and Ron slumped in the driver's seat. He felt warm blood running down his lips, He must have smashed his face against the steering wheel. His eyes opened, but that didn't improve his visibility much. He tried turning on the headlights. One of them, the undamaged one, lit up. Wiping his face with his sleeve, he opened the car door and stepped out into the darkness. Then he pulled one of the flashlights from his pocket and looked around. Ron realized he had driven into some kind of abandoned, unfinished tunnel that wasn't marked on the map. Crumbled monolithic concrete blocks made up part of the walls. Some of them were cracked or had fallen out of the masonry. The tunnel was clearly a road tunnel because it ran along an asphalt roadway with small sidewalks on either side featuring waist-high granite curbs, one of which he had crashed into. The tunnel was 2-lane and wide. The young man could even make out the light fixtures installed in niches beneath the vaulted ceiling. But they weren't lit and were clearly not connected to anything. Why the tunnel had been built after a forest road, one that was half abandoned and ended in a cliff, was a complete mystery. The young man carefully inspected the front of the car and came to a disheartening conclusion. There was no way he could drive it back. The right wheel was crushed, the hub was broken off, and the wheel had been ripped right off the axle. He had already mentally calculated how much money he'd have to shell out to the car-sharing company. Well, he could put that off for now. First, he had to figure out how to get out of this situation. There were two options: turn back and climb a fairly steep hill through the muddy slush, then follow his old tracks back. That would take several hours, and it was already starting to get dark. Ron wasn't at all keen on that prospect, even though he loved hiking. His head ached, he felt dizzy, and he was slightly nauseous. Perhaps the after effects of a concussion, the prospect of walking at night along a half-abandoned forest road, which also carried the risk of encountering a rare forest predator, was far from appealing. The second option was to go through that strange tunnel. After all, since it wasn't marked on any maps, Ron assumed the tunnel was still under construction. Perhaps at the other end, there would be either a construction crew or an exit onto a busier road. Ron peered intently into the darkness. It seemed to him that he could make out a faint, flickering glimmer in the distance, though it was hard to judge the distance. His fatigue and headache were taking their toll. How long could this underground corridor possibly be? Well, a kilometer at most, because who would build such a massive structure here, far from any major cities? And why? Ron resolutely pulled his small backpack and a bottle of water out of the car, unwrapped one of the chocolate bars, and set off hesitantly. After finishing the chocolate bar and tossing the wrapper aside, Ron noticed that the echo of his own footsteps was driving him crazy. He had never been underground before, and now the echo of his own footsteps was pounding painfully in his ears, making his headache worse. A watch with a tiny backlight showed 11 o'clock at night. The guy had decided to time how long it would take him to walk through. It seemed like it would be about 20 minutes, no more. After walking a short distance, he looked back to see how far he'd gotten from the car, but couldn't see it. Perhaps the single headlight had gone out, and the flashlight's beam didn't reach that far. The air was damp and sticky, stagnant. He walked, recalling the stories about mountain trolls his grandmother used to tell him. In those tales, the cave creatures often lured wayward travelers into their lairs. A melody from the In the Hall of the Mountain King suite from Peer Gynt began to play in his head. A strange melody, and a mesmerizing one at that. Perhaps some unknown evil spirit had lured him here as well. His headache had eased slightly, but the melody was haunting and now stirred his foggy mind. Ron shook himself and glanced at his watch. 15 minutes had already passed, yet the exit seemed no closer. He pulled out a more powerful flashlight. It immediately made him feel more at ease, but even its beam vanished into the enveloping darkness ahead. Strangely, there were none of the ubiquitous gnats that usually swirled in the air, nor any lost birds, nor, as he had expected to see, any bats that make their home in abandoned underground passages. The guy quickened his pace, determined to reach the exit as quickly as possible. The nagging Cave King in his head was already building toward its climax when Ron tripped over a pothole in the asphalt, fell flat on his face, and dropped the flashlight. He watched as his little beam of light spun through the air. It didn't shatter, but rolled on. With a clang from its steel handle, the beam of light suddenly spun in place, rose, and hung in the air. Ron held his breath. The flashlight continued to spin, rising toward the ceiling. Then it was as if a huge, silent hand had squeezed it, and sputtering a few sparks, it went out. The boy couldn't believe his eyes. He blinked, but darkness closed in on him from all sides. He fumbled in his pocket for a second dimmer flashlight and shone its beam ahead. Pieces of his trusty camping lamp lay scattered on the road. He brushed himself off, stood up, and cautiously approached the debris. Nothing. Just silence. He tilted his head back, but the silent vault of the sky held the darkness tightly. Ron felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end, and exhaling, he rushed forward. Usually, when a person is alone in the dark, they feel something breathing down their neck, an ancient fear dating back to cave dwellers. But now Ron sensed that the threat was breathing everywhere. The tunnel had suddenly changed, altering its very spatial nature. The young man could see nothing but dark walls, but he sensed movement all around him above on the ceiling, below at his feet, from all sides. Huge, sticky tentacles of darkness were closing in on him. He could run, walk, crawl, or sit still, but none of that mattered now. A vast, shapeless mass was moving in all directions inside the tunnel, revealing itself all at once, though not yet approaching him and marking its now visible presence. Ron looked up at the ceiling with skepticism and saw red glowing dots deep within the vault. They shimmered with a crimson hue, contracting and expanding. At first, the young man thought they were some kind of fluorescent insects, but when he shone his flashlight, he saw only a barely discernible black mass with red streaks. Suddenly, the lone man realized that these were not just streaks, but eyes. The eyes of a strange creature, a shapeless mass that dwelled in this tunnel. He could feel the movements of ghostly appendages, hundreds of antennae, dense tangles, and branches. They shifted shape, transforming into wings, paws, claws, the sharp, stinging tentacles of jellyfish, and the venomous legs of a praying mantis. And only one small detail prevented this thing from entangling him, from enveloping him in its cocoon. Ron had barely realized this when the darkness sprang into action. Like a swarm of insects, it wrapped itself around his arm, preventing him from running away, but then suddenly jerked him up toward the ceiling. He only had time to let out a cry. His hand snapped shut with a crunch. He could feel his bones cracking, blood flowing into his jacket sleeve, and the plastic in the center of his palm bursting. He was hanging, probably about 5 meters above the ground, while a powerful shadow, claw, squeezed his hand. The flashlight flickered pitifully a few times and went out, and the darkness released him, as if a cat had grown tired of a toy. Ron fell onto the cold concrete. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and he doubled over several times, frantically trying to catch his breath before his lungs expanded again. Stars danced before his eyes. The damned melody rang in his ears. He coughed, clutching his severed palm with his uninjured hand, and began to scream without stopping, until his scream faded to a whisper, and he wept like a small child. A heavy, multi-dimensional body entwined him from all sides, like a giant centipede. He felt something smooth and cold against his back. Ghostly worms trickled down his legs, and swarms of spiders crawled across his shoulders. The ceiling was closing in on him, and the red dots were growing larger. That's how the eyes of a predator widen once it has already tasted its prey. Ron froze in silent horror, frantically trying to find a way out. And then something familiar pressed against his side with a cold plastic grip. A thought like a bolt of lightning seared through his mind, and the young man raised his good hand, clutching the signal pistol. He licked his lips, dry from the tension, and prayed to unknown, distant gods. Please, let the cartridge not be damp. There was a click, followed by a triumphant hiss. A bright beam of green light sliced through his eyes like a razor, rising from the trunk with a bright, heavy glow and shooting straight up into the open red slits. A cacophony of hissing and silent pain spread across the vaults. In an instant, the intertwined tentacles released their prey, scattering in all directions. Ron exhaled and, leaning awkwardly on his injured arm, opened his backpack, pulled out another light cartridge, and with a trembling hand, loaded it into the barrel. He had been a hair's breadth from death. Clumsily jumping to his feet, the boy limped forward. A large white gap loomed ahead, and Ron realized he could finally see a way out. The darkness released him, but did not recede. He rushed forward, away from the ancient demons, away from the mountain trolls, away from the vile claws reaching for him from places where sunlight never reaches. He laughed and cried like a madman, stumbling as he ran, afraid to look back. He shook with silent laughter, the air rushing out of him. He could barely breathe, but still he was alive. Alive. With a sweeping motion, Ron leaped forward just before the world went dark. The open arch was right there, but for some reason it began to collapse upward, shifting its position in space. He even managed to catch a glimpse of the moon, staring blankly at him from afar before plummeting into the void. Right at the exit was a treacherous trap, a huge concrete well. With a desperate scream, Ron plummeted downward, trying to figure out what had happened. He didn't fall to the bottom of the well, but continued flying straight into the gaping maw, into the belly of the shapeless thing that filled this tunnel. In desperation, he squeezed the trigger, but the green spark choked in a whirlpool of rustling black flies, writhing worms, and black dust. Darkness filled the space around him, contracted and crushed the flame, and it went out with a hiss, breaking the last barrier between man and the all-consuming thing. Ron screamed, was drowned out by a strange, indescribable melody. Black smoke filled his lungs, and an icy sludge flooded his stomach, spreading like a disease and driving the last remnants of light from his blood. His blood vessels burst, his skin charred, and his bones contracted and crumbled into shapeless fragments. He didn't have time to feel the pain in an instant. All that remained of him were fragments of his physical form, while his mind plummeted into an indescribable void, accompanied by a chthonic melody. In the middle of the night, the construction workers were awakened by an inhuman scream. They had just been relaxing after a hard day's work, playing cards. They had recently been tasked with clearing out an old, unfinished tunnel in the forest and building a new road to it in order to connect the highway to the suburbs. When the foreman ran up to the tunnel, he immediately turned on the generator and, after his eyes adjusted to the bright light, rushed into the darkness of the tunnel with a couple of guys. The man didn't much like being there at night, and although the work had only been going on for a week, strange rumors began to spread among the workers about light bulbs burning out and lanterns going dark in the tunnel. A young man was lying in a shallow drainage, well near the exit. He was wheezing pitifully. Apparently, he no longer had the strength to scream. He looked to be about 25 years old, but his hair was completely gray and his clothes were caked with clay. He was clutching a signal pistol in his hands. A spent signal flare was smoldering nearby. Deep inside the tunnel, the workers saw a flashlight, its beam shining alone at the ceiling. The young man couldn't say anything coherent, and even as they carried him out into the light, he lay curled up in a fetal position. He hadn't sustained any visible injuries in the fall, but he was clearly out of his mind. His car was found at the entrance to the tunnel, wrecked, with a missing wheel and a headlight that was still working. His documents revealed that he was a tourist, so they called the police. The police inspected the tunnel, questioned the workers, and paramedics took the injured man to the hospital. He lay there on a stretcher, unable to say a word. After the emergency services left, one of the workers went deeper into the tunnel and looked around. With the lights on, it seemed to him that the tunnel walls were oozing some kind of strange black slime. But upon closer inspection, he realized it was just an optical illusion. The nighttime moisture on the walls was reflecting the glare from the lights. The worker turned off the generator and headed to the break room. Tomorrow would be just another work day, and it was time to go to bed. After all, behind him was just an ordinary dark tunnel, nothing out of the ordinary.